moment Lenora Wolfe walked into the grand court of Nocturne Keep and announced that Silas Nocturne had been meeting her every Thursday for 6 weeks, the entire vampire assembly went silent in a way that felt less like shock and more like the held breath before an explosion. She had not meant to start a war. She had meant to end one. Lenora stood at the center of the obsidian floor, her dark auburn hair catching the amber light of 1,000 candelabras that lined the vaulted ceiling above her, and she did not flinch. Not when 300 vampires turned their pale, luminous faces toward her. Not when the lords in their silver-threaded coats rose from their seats along the tiered gallery walls. Not even when Countess Vrain, the most ancient female in the court aside from Silas himself, pressed forward with her white hair coiled like a crown of frost and her silver eyes burning with something that was not quite fury and was not quite disbelief. "You are lying," Vrain said, her voice carrying across the chamber the way that thunder carries across an empty valley. "Silas Nocturne has not permitted a human into his private residence in 340 years. He has barely permitted his own court within those walls. He permitted me," Lenora said. She kept her chin level. Her voice did not shake. This was the voice she used when a classroom full of teenagers tried to make her feel small, and it had never failed her, and she refused to let it fail her now. Every Thursday evening. He sits at the far end of a library that smells like aged cedar and something older than cedar, and I bring lesson plans because he asked me to teach him something. The silence that followed that statement was a different kind of silence entirely. Because here was the thing that the court of Silas Nocturne had accepted as absolute truth for the better part of 4 centuries. Silas wanted nothing. He sought nothing. He ruled his ancient territory in the old world tradition with iron precision. He attended the required seasonal convocations, and then he retreated behind the walls of Nocturne Keep, and he stayed there, alone, communicating through written decree and through his second, a lean and careful vampire named Aldrich Voss, who had served him for 160 years without ever once suggesting that his lord wanted company. The court had built an entire mythology around Silas's solitude. He was the ancient, the unmoved, the last of the first-turning bloodline still walking the modern world. He had survived the blood purges of the 17th century and the sunlight accords of the 20th. He had outlived every vampire who had ever tried to challenge him, and most of the vampires who had simply tried to know him. And now a human schoolteacher from the east side of the city was standing in his court, telling them he had been asking her to come back every week. Lenora had not meant to be here today. She had meant to be in her apartment, reviewing curriculum notes for Monday's classes. But Aldrich had appeared at her door that morning, quiet and unsettling in the way that only very old things can be unsettling, and he had told her in a measured voice that Silas had been taken, that 3 members of a rival faction, loyal to a vampire lord named Casimir Dread, had followed her scent back from the keep on the previous Thursday, identified her as an anomaly in Silas's behavior, and taken her from the street, outside a coffee shop at 7 in the morning, which was technically safe daylight hours, but which proved that Casimir's people had human collaborators who did not need to avoid sunlight. They had taken her. And then something extraordinary had happened. Silas Nocturne, who had not left the keep in an act of open aggression in over a century, had walked out into the pre-dawn dark and retrieved her personally, not through Aldrich, not through a written decree, not through any of the dozens of mechanisms available to an ancient vampire lord who preferred distance and delegation. He had come himself, which meant that by the time he returned her safely to her apartment, at 4 in the morning, every spy and observer in the vampire community knew that the ancient had a weakness, and it wore auburn hair and carried a canvas tote bag full of lesson plans, and its name was Lenora Wolfe, which meant that Lenora had approximately 48 hours before someone in the court used that information against him. So she had come here herself, which Aldrich had called brave and possibly catastrophic, and she had walked into the Grand Court, and she had said what she knew, not to shame him, not to expose him, to protect him first. Before anyone else could use her as a weapon, he asked me to teach him, Lenora said again, meeting Vrain's silver eyes steadily. Because Silas Nocturne, for all of his centuries and all of his power, has never in his life had someone simply sit across a table from him and talk to him as though he were a person rather than a force of nature. He told me that himself, and I am telling you this publicly, because Casimir Dread's people already know it, and I would rather this court hear it from me, in a form that gives Silas dignity, than hear it from Casimir's people in a form designed to look like a vulnerability. The gallery erupted. She stood in the middle of it, perfectly still, while vampires who had been alive for centuries shouted at each other in 3 languages, and Vrain stared at her with an expression that had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from fury to something that might have been calculation. Remove the human, someone called from the upper tier. She came voluntarily, Aldrich said from the gallery floor, and his voice cut through the noise with practiced efficiency. Blood law forbids the coercion or detention of a voluntary human witness who presents herself to the court in a matter of lord-level concern. Article 11 of the Sunlight Accords. The noise did not stop, but it changed register. Legal precedent did that in courts, human or otherwise. It was into this charged and fractured noise that the doors at the far end of the chamber opened, and Silas Nocturne walked in. Lenora had seen him in his library, in the low, warm light, wearing dark clothing that fit like it had been made for him. Because it had been made for him, and she had thought him extraordinary in that setting. She had not prepared herself for what he looked like, walking into a room full of his own people. He was tall, 6.5 feet of absolute physical authority, with white hair that fell straight to his collar, and skin so pale it caught the candlelight and held it like marble holds heat. His eyes were the color of deep water, a blue that was almost silver, almost gray, almost nothing a human eye chart could adequately describe. He wore no court regalia, no ceremonial chain or inherited insignia. He wore a dark coat over a white shirt, and he walked into that chamber the way that geological events move, slowly and with consequences, and every voice in the room stopped completely. Then those deep-water eyes found Lenora in the center of the floor, and something happened in them that Lenora had only seen twice before, both times in the library when she had said something that surprised him, something that looked, in a face built for command, startlingly like relief. He crossed the chamber floor without looking at anyone else. The assembled court parted for him the way water parts for stone. He stopped 2 feet from Lenora, looked down at her, and said in a voice that was quiet and entirely for her, "I told you not to come here." "You told me it was dangerous," Lenora said. "You did not tell me not to come." A muscle in his jaw moved. "That distinction will keep me awake. You do not sleep, Lenora." "I came because Casimir's people were going to use me against you, and I decided I would rather use myself for you." She held his gaze. "I told them about Thursdays. I told them you asked me to come. I did not tell them why you asked, because that is yours to share or not share. But I thought the court should hear the shape of it from someone who was not trying to destroy you." He looked at her for a long moment. In the absolute silence of 300 vampires, holding very still, the look between them carried everything that had accumulated over 6 weeks of Thursday evenings. All the careful conversation and the growing trust and the specific, irreversible warmth that happens when a person who has been alone for too long is seen by someone willing to look. "You walked into my court," Silas said slowly, "to protect me, yes, knowing that every vampire in this room would identify you as my weakness and spend the next decade finding ways to leverage that. I thought of a few counter-arguments on the way over, actually," Lenora said. "Would you like to hear them?" Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, because Silas Nocturne had not smiled fully in longer than she had been alive. But it was the shape that a smile comes from, the precursor architecture of it, and it made him look momentarily, devastatingly human. "Later," he said. "First we address the court." He turned, and the turn itself was a statement, slow and deliberate, presenting his profile to the gallery with the complete, unhurried confidence of a man who has never once in his life worried about the room's opinion, only its compliance. "You will have questions," Silas said to the assembled court, and his voice filled the chamber without effort, the way that very old voices fill old spaces, because both were built for exactly this. "Some of them are reasonable. Most of them are irrelevant. I will address the relevant ones." He paused. "The human standing beside me is Lenora Wolfe. She is a secondary school teacher specializing in literature and history. She has been a guest in my private residence at my explicit invitation for 6 weeks. She came to this court today voluntarily, without my knowledge, and did so at considerable personal risk to ensure that information about our association reached you through a source motivated by my protection rather than by political maneuvering." Another pause. "I am aware of how this appears to the court. I will address that appearance directly. But first, I will address Casimir Dread." The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. "Casimir's people touched a human guest under my protection," Silas said. "A human who was not in my residence at the time, but who had been invited there by me, and who therefore carries the protection of ancient hospitality law from the moment of first invitations until the formal withdrawal of that invitation. The Sunlight Accords, Article 7. The Old World Code, Section 12. Blood law, older than most of this court's lineage, which states that to touch what has been claimed by a lord-level ancient is to offer your lord for judgment, a beat. I am not going to pursue Casimir through the legal architecture of this court. I am going to go and see him personally, the way my kind handled such matters before we had courts to hide behind." No one in the room said a word. Lenora, who had been listening to all of this with the precise attention she gave to information that mattered, noticed that Silas had said the word claimed and that the court had noticed it too. She also noticed that he was standing approximately inches closer to her than he had been when he stopped. She did not step back. She had learned over 6 Thursday evenings that stepping back from Silas Nocturne was never the right answer. The right answer was to hold your ground and let him figure out where he stood relative to it. "Vrain," Silas said to the Countess, "you will oversee the legal record of today's proceedings. Aldrich will provide you with documentation of the hospitality declaration. I am formally filing Lenora Wolfe as a protected guest of Nocturne Keep under blood law, which means that her safety is now a court-level matter, not a personal one. A beat. Questions at the next convocation. This session is closed." He turned back to Lenora with the air of someone who's had just handled routine administrative business and said, "Come." She went, not because he commanded it, and not because she was helpless in any sense of the word, but because she knew that what had just happened in this room had consequences that would need to be processed somewhere quieter, and also because in 6 weeks of Thursday evenings, she had come to understand that the particular quality of Silas Nocturne's company was unlike anything else she had ever experienced, and she was not ready for the evening to end. They rode back to Nocturne, keeping silence in the back of a black car driven by one of Aldrich's people, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who have shared enough space to not require constant noise. The keep was extraordinary in the way that all genuinely old things are extraordinary, simultaneously out of place and more real than anything built around it. It occupied a full city block in what was technically a historic preservation zone, which was convenient. From the street, it looked like an overbuilt Victorian civic building, all dark stone and narrow arched windows, which had served for 130 years as adequate camouflage. Inside, it opened up into spaces that belonged to a different century entirely, vaulted and carved and lit in the amber warmth of sources that predated electricity. Silas brought her to the library. Of course he brought her to the library. It was the room where everything between them had started, and it was the room where Lenora suspected everything between them was going to have to be honestly addressed, because what she had done in the court tonight had changed the stakes of the thing they had been carefully, silently building for 6 weeks. She sat in her usual chair. He did not sit. He stood with his back to her at the long window that looked into the inner courtyard, and for a moment he was just the silhouette of him against the courtyard lights. Very tall and very still. "You could have been killed," he said. "By whom? Your court. Casimir's people would have intercepted you before you arrived if they had been watching the keep's approaches." He turned from the window. "I had Aldrich ensure they were not. But you did not know that when you decided to come." "No," Lenora agreed. "I did not know that. So you walked into a situation you knew to be potentially fatal." "I walked into a situation I believed to be necessary," she said. "There is a difference. I made a calculation. I weighed the risk of doing nothing against the risk of acting, and I chose to act." She met his eyes. "I will not apologize for that." He looked at her for a long time. In the warm cedar-scented air of the library, surrounded by 3,000 books and the accumulated weight of centuries, Silas Nocturne looked at Lenora Wolfe with an expression that had been building for 6 weeks and had not yet found its proper form. "When Aldrich told me you had gone to the court," he said, "before I knew you were safe, there was a period of approximately 4 minutes when I did not know where you were or whether you were in danger. I have lived for over 500 years. I have faced things that would end most of what exists in this world. In those 4 minutes I was more afraid than I have been in 3 centuries. The air in the room changed. Lenora had been a teacher long enough to know that the most important moments in a conversation are not the ones where people say the most. They are the ones where people say the true thing, the thing that costs them something. "Tell me why you asked me to come here the first time," she said softly. "Tell me the actual reason, not the one you gave Aldrich." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he moved, not pacing but shifting, and he sat in the chair across from her that was not quite his chair, because no chair in this library was his chair except in the sense that everything here was his, and he looked at his own hands for a moment in a way that was very human. "I watched you teach," he said, "not in person. Through the legal observation protocol that allows Lord-level vampires to monitor areas adjacent to their territory. Your school is 12 blocks from the outer boundary of Nocturne Keep. I was monitoring the area for Casimir's surveillance units, and I encountered your classroom on the monitor feed, and I stopped." He looked up. "You were teaching a class of 16-year-olds about the French Revolution. Half of them were not paying attention. You knew they were not paying attention, and instead of compelling their attention, which I understand human teachers are not supposed to do, you changed your approach. You stopped mid-sentence and said to the room, 'I know this feels like ancient history with no connection to you right now, and I am going to spend the next 10 minutes making that connection so real that you will remember it when you are 40. And then you did exactly that." Lenora did not say anything. "I watched for 11 minutes, Silas said. "Then I had Aldrich find out your name. Then I had him establish whether there was any legal mechanism by which I could invite a human teacher to my private residence, without triggering court scrutiny, which, as it turns out there was, hospitality protocol for non-supernatural professional consultants. I told Aldrich I was interested in a historical perspective on certain events I had lived through but wished to understand from a human academic standpoint." A pause. "That was partially true. What was the other part?" Lenora asked. "I wanted to know what it was like," Silas said, "to be in the same room as someone who cared that much about making things understood. I have been alive for 540 years, and most of the people I have spent time with in that time wanted something from me: power, protection, alliance, knowledge, access. Aldrich is loyal to me, and I value that loyalty beyond measure. But Aldrich is my second, and our relationship is built on a framework of service and trust that is not the same as simple human company." He paused again. "You came the first Thursday, and you spread your lesson plans on my table, and you told me that if I was going to insist on participating in your curriculum planning session, I was going to have opinions about primary source documents, and you pushed a file across the table at me that contained excerpts from 17th century political pamphlets, and you asked me what I thought the author was actually afraid of." He looked at her steadily. "No one has asked me what I thought about something in that way in longer than I can calculate. As though my answer mattered because the question was interesting, not because my answer would determine their fate." Lenora's chest ached in a way she had been quietly managing for several weeks. "You came back the second Thursday," he said, "and the third. And you argued with me about the reliability of historical eyewitness accounts, and you told me I was being epistemically arrogant about my own recollections, because memory is always mediated by perspective. And you were right, which I told you, and you looked at me like it was normal for someone to simply admit when they were wrong." He shook his head slightly. "I have not built a court and survived 5 centuries by admitting when I am wrong, Lenora. And yet," she said, "and yet the fire in the library hearth settled and shifted, and the cedar and old paper smell of the room was exactly what it had been for 6 Thursday evenings, warm and present, and more itself than most of the world outside it." "I should tell you something," Lenora said. "Since we are doing on the honest version of this conversation," he waited. "I knew by the 3rd Thursday that this was not a professional consulting arrangement. I knew that you were not primarily interested in the historical curriculum angle. I told myself that I should maintain appropriate distance and not develop personal investment in a situation that was professionally unusual and probably not sustainable. She looked at him steadily. I had that conversation with myself. And then Thursday came around and I got in a car and came here anyway. And I have been arguing with myself about it ever since. What does the argument conclude? Silas asked. It concludes, Lenora said carefully, that I am an adult who makes considered choices, and that whatever is happening between us is considerably more than a consulting arrangement, and that I would rather address that directly than pretend otherwise, especially since I just stood up in front of your entire court and implied it loudly enough that pretense is no longer particularly available. A long pause. You are not afraid of me, Silas said. It was not quite a question. You are terrifying, Lenora said honestly. You are 540 years old and you just told 300 vampires that you were going to go have a personal conversation with a rival lord who had people kidnap me, and the room reacted the way a room reacts when someone says something unquestionable. You are the most powerful thing I have ever sat across a table from. She paused. I am not afraid of you. Why not? Because every Thursday for 6 weeks you have been careful with me. Not careful in the way that someone is careful with something fragile. Careful in the way that someone is careful with something they value. She held his gaze. And because the way you just described watching my classroom and having Aldrich find my name and building a legal justification to invite me here was possibly the most elaborate thing anyone has ever done, because they wanted to be in the same room as me, and I am a secondary school teacher, Silas. I am not immune to that. He stood. He moved across the library to the window again, but this time he turned back immediately, as though the window had not given him what he was looking for. I am not built for simpleton things, he said. I have ruled this territory for 2 centuries. I have navigated blood law and court politics, and the deaths of everyone I have known long enough to know well. I am not a person who makes small choices or feels small feelings, and whatever I feel about you is not small, and I am aware that I am not easy, Lenora, and that what I am offering, if I am offering anything, is not uncomplicated. Silas, Lenora said, I am trying to be honest with you about the cost. I know what complicated looks like. I stood in front of your court this evening and invoked your hospitality protocols and made myself a political variable in your territory. I am not looking for uncomplicated. She stood too. I am looking for real, and what you just said was real. He crossed the distance between them in 2 of his long, unhurried steps and stopped close enough that she would have had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. And she did, because stepping back was still not the right answer. This will not be safe, he said quietly. I know. Casimir is not the only threat. There are those on my own court who will see you as leverage or as contamination, as evidence that I am weakening. Old laws require that an ancient's chosen consort be evaluated by the full court and approved through a declaration process that is largely ceremonial, but not entirely harmless. I will not let anything happen to you. That is not something I say lightly. But I want you to understand the full weight of what standing beside me means. Are you asking me if I want to stand beside you? Lenora said. Yes. She reached up and placed her hand against his jaw, the way she had been thinking about doing for a specific number of Thursday evenings. And she felt the stillness in him, the careful held quality of a very powerful thing choosing not to move. Yes, she said. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were the color of the deep part of the ocean, the part that does not have a name. I have some conditions, Lenora added. Of course you do. I keep my job. I keep my apartment. I do not give up my life to come and live in a library, lovely as this library is. We build something that fits both of us, not one of us. Agreed. And you have to keep arguing with me about the reliability of historical sources, because that was the best intellectual conversation I have had in 3 years, and I am not ready to give it up. Something that was fully, finally, completely a smile moved across his face, and it was extraordinary, the smile of a person who had forgotten they could, rediscovering the motion. Agreed, he said again. He brought her hand from his jaw and held it. And they stood like that in the library for a moment that contained everything that had accumulated between them, and it was the most natural thing in the world, despite being utterly unprecedented in the history of Nocturne. The problem of Casimir Dread did not resolve itself by remaining in the library. Silas addressed it 4 days later, and Lenora was not present for that meeting, which was a deliberate decision they made together, because Silas was clear that what he was going to say to Casimir was not something he wanted her to witness, not from squeamishness but from practicality. The meeting would be negotiation by implication and old-world threat, and the presence of a human in that room would complicate the power dynamic in ways that worked against the outcome they wanted. Lenora, who had her own opinions about being excluded from conversations that were partly about her, expressed those opinions at length on a Wednesday evening in the library, and Silas listened to all of them with the focused attention he gave to everything she said, and then explained his reasoning in detail, and she pushed back on 2 points, and he conceded one of them and held firm on the other, and in the end she agreed because his reasoning was sound, and she trusted his judgment in the architecture of vampire politics, the way he trusted her judgment in the architecture of historical analysis. Trust, she had learned, was not the same as agreement. It was the thing that allowed you to disagree without fracturing. Casimir Dread was a vampire lord of the newer school, 300 years old, which was young by court standards and ambitious in the way that 300-year-old vampire lords always were, looking for leverage against the old bloodlines, looking for evidence that the ancient lords were diminishing. He had been the one to identify Lenora as a potential pressure point, and he had made the catastrophic error of acting on that identification. Before understanding what it meant that Silas had chosen to involve himself, Silas went to see Casimir in the neutral territory of the city's underground chambers, the labyrinth of old stone corridors beneath the historic district that predated the city by several centuries and served as the meeting ground for vampire political business that was too sensitive for formal court proceedings. He brought Aldrich and 2 others. He brought no weapons, because Silas Nocturne, at 540 years old, was the weapon, and had been for longer than anyone in those underground chambers had been alive. He sat across a stone table from Casimir, who had white blonde hair and sharp cheekbones, and eyes the color of dirty ice, and he said, in the measured, unhurried tone that had preceded the end of several political careers in vampire history, that Casimir had violated blood law and ancient hospitality code, and that there were 3 remedies available to him. He could submit to formal court judgment. He could choose trial by a council of neutral ancients, of which there were precisely 4 still walking the earth, none of whom would be inclined toward leniency. Or he could withdraw his claim to the Eastern District expansion he had been pursuing for 40 years, cede formal acknowledgement that Lenora Wolfe fell under Nocturne Keep's absolute protection, and retire from active court politics for a period of not less than 75 years, Casimir, who was ambitious but not stupid, took the third option. He also, in the formal language of the Blood Law Declaration, acknowledged that his people had acted outside their mandate in taking Lenora from the street, and that the ancient's response had been fully within his rights, and that any future action against Lenora Wolfe would be treated by the full vampire court as a direct attack on lord-level territory. Silas returned to the keep and told Lenora all of this, completely and without omission, sitting across from her in the library with his hands folded on the table between them and his voice carrying everything it always carried when he spoke to her, the fullness of his attention. She listened. She asked 3 pointed questions. She told him he had negotiated well, and she meant it without condescension, the way she meant everything she said to him, directly and without decoration. "Is it over?" she asked. "Casimir is over," Silas said. "He will honor the declaration. He does not have a choice in the framework of blood law, and he knows it. There will be others over time, because there are always others, and my territory and my choices will always attract scrutiny. But the immediate threat is resolved, and the court declaration of your protection status changes the calculation for anyone considering a similar approach. So I am officially under vampire court protection. You are officially under my protection, which the court has acknowledged as binding on all parties within its jurisdiction." He looked at her. "It is not nothing. It is not nothing," Lenora agreed. "It is also moderately surreal. I was grading papers on coastal erosion for my Year 10 class this morning. How are they progress better than they were in October? Marcus finally understood the longshore drift diagram after I had him model it with his hands, which he found embarrassing and which was probably why it worked. Silas absorbed this with the same focused interest he gave everything about her work. He had, over the weeks, developed what she could only describe as genuine enthusiasm for the pedagogical problems she brought to the Thursday conversations, asking questions about student psychology and curriculum design, and the specific challenge of making abstract concepts feel visceral to people who had not yet lived enough to recognize why they mattered. She had not told him yet that his questions had made her a better teacher. She was working up to it. The court convocation that was scheduled for the first week of December was the one where the formal evaluation of Lenora's status was supposed to take place. The one Silas had mentioned, the largely ceremonial but not entirely harmless declaration process. Lenora spent 2 weeks preparing for it, which meant 2 things in parallel. She continued her ordinary life, teaching her classes and attending department meetings and buying groceries and calling her sister on Sunday evenings, the ordinary layered texture of a human life that she refused to sacrifice or minimize. And she also sat with Aldrich on 2 separate afternoons while he walked her through the historical precedent and legal architecture of the declaration process, the specific questions the court elder panel would ask, the traditional responses, the ones that were phrased as optional but were actually not optional, and the ones that genuinely gave her a choice. "There is one question," Aldrich said on the second afternoon. Sitting very properly in a chair in the keep's lower receiving room, with a stack of documents on the table in front of him that were written in 3 languages and looked like they had survived multiple civilizations, that the elder panel will ask you that I want you to be prepared for. They will ask you if you understand the nature of the binding. "What is the binding?" Lenora asked. When a human accepts formal protected status under a lord-level ancient, it is not simply a legal declaration. It carries a specific consequence for the ancient in question. Aldrich chose his next words with the care of someone who knew their weight. Silas has not told you this himself yet, and I am telling you because you deserve to understand it before you stand in front of the elder panel, and because Silas will tell you himself tonight, if you give him the opportunity. But I want to ensure you have time to think. Tell me, Lenora said. The binding means that Silas's blood law obligation to your safety is absolute and unconditional. If you were in danger, he would be compelled to go to you regardless of any other consideration. Political situation, personal safety, court order. The compulsion is not external, it is intrinsic. It becomes part of what he is, a pause, for an ancient of his age and standing, agreeing to a binding of this nature is not a small thing. It is irreversible. It is the most significant voluntary constraint an ancient vampire can place on themselves. Lenora was quiet for a moment. He knew this when he filed the protection declaration. She said, "Yes. He did not tell me the full cost." "He will," Aldrich said. "He is trying to figure out how to tell you without it feeling like a claim on your response. He is concerned that if you know the cost to him, you will feel obligated toward him in a way that is not freely chosen." Aldrich's expression, which was generally precise and contained, held something that was very close to fondness. He is, for all of his centuries, occasionally very foolish about the things that matter most to him. Silas told her that evening. He brought it into the library conversation the way he brought everything important directly, and without evasion, explaining the binding, its history, its permanence, and what it meant for his freedom of action in the abstract. "You should have told me before you filed the declaration," Lenora said. "I know. That was not your choice to make alone. I am aware. At the time I made it, my primary concern was your safety, and the declaration was the fastest legal mechanism available to establish it. I did not stop to consult you first. That was a failure of the principle that we are building something that fits both of us." He met her eyes. "I am sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. "Does the binding work both ways?" He blinked. It was the first time she had ever seen him do that, in a context of surprise. "In what sense?" "The compulsion is yours, I understand that. But is there a human side equivalent? Is there something I can conformally declare that establishes my commitment in this framework with the same weight?" He was very still. "There is an old world ceremony. It predates the blood laws and the sunlight accords. It was used in the early centuries when a human chose to stand in formal alliance with a vampire house. The human makes a declaration of chosen loyalty before the court, and the court acknowledges it as binding human side. It is not compulsory. It has not been invoked in over 200 years. "Then I will invoke it," Lenora said. "At the December convocation, I will declare the human side alliance, and the court will acknowledge it, and you will have something that corresponds to what you gave me." She held his gaze. "We said we were building something that fits both of us. That means both of us have skin in the game." He looked at her. In that way he had been looking at her more and more frequently. The way that was not something she could fully decode, but that she could feel, a quality of attention that was beyond careful. "That was something else entirely. You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "There is often significant overlap." He laughed. She had heard him produce sounds that functioned like amusement before, controlled and brief, but this was a laugh, actual and warm, and it changed his face completely, made him look like something that had been locked in a formal portrait for centuries, suddenly remembering that it could move. She thought, in that moment, that she was irrevocably and without reservation in love with him. She did not say it yet. She was holding it in the way you hold something very good before you give it away, turning it over once to be certain of it. She was certain. But she wanted the right moment, and the right moment was not yet. The December convocation was held in the Grand Court of Nocturne Keep, and it was attended by every vampire lord and elder within the court's jurisdiction, which meant the room was full of extraordinary faces and extraordinary tension and the particular species of old-world ceremony that had not changed its fundamental architecture in 4 centuries. Lenora wore a dark green dress that Aldrich had suggested correctly was the appropriate register for the occasion. She wore her hair down. She had spent approximately 45 minutes in front of her bathroom mirror, reminding herself that she had stood up in front of rooms full of people for years, and this was not different in kind, only in scale and consequence. It was, she admitted privately, somewhat different in kind. The elder panel was 5 vampires, whose collective age was somewhere in the range of 3,000 years. They asked their questions in formal language that Aldrich had prepared her for, and she answered clearly and without hesitation. When they asked if she understood the nature of the binding, she said yes, and she explained it back to them accurately and in detail, which produced a visible reaction of surprise in several of the panel members, because clearly they had expected less preparation. When they asked if she accepted the status freely and without coercion, she said yes, and she did not elaborate, because the simplest answer was the truest one. Then she asked, in the formal phrasing Aldrich had helped her construct to invoke the human side, alliance declaration. The chamber went very quiet in a way that was different from the earlier silence. This was not shock. This was something older than shock, something that recognized itself. One of the elder panel members, a vampire whose white hair reached her waist and whose eyes were entirely silver without pupil, said, "This declaration has not been invoked since the year 1783. I am aware," Lenora said. "I am invoking it." The elder looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "State your name and your choosing." "Lenora Wolfe," Lenora said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber the way she had learned to project it in classrooms and now in rooms considerably more fraught. "I choose the House of Nocturne. I choose its lord. I choose this alliance with full understanding of its permanence and its cost, and I ask the court to witness and record this choosing." From the gallery above the chamber floor, where Silas stood at the railing because he had been told that court protocol required the Lord to observe the declaration process from a position of non-participation, there was a silence that lasted approximately 2 seconds and felt considerably longer. Then the elder with the silver eyes said, "The court witnesses and records, let it be known in blood law." And 300 vampires in the gallery and on the chamber floor responded in the old tongue, the formal acknowledgement, and the sound of it together was something that resonated in the stone of the keep, the way very old languages resonate in places built for them. Lenora let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 45 minutes. The convocation continued through the formal declaration process and the court business that accompanied it, and when it concluded and the assembly began its gradual, ceremonious dispersal, Silas came down from the gallery. He crossed the chamber floor to her again, as he had the first time, and the court parted for him again, and he stopped in front of her with an expression on his face that she had never seen before, and that she thought might be the look of someone who had received something they had genuinely stopped expecting. "You invoked the Human Side Alliance," he said. "I did. Aldrich told you about it. Aldrich told me it existed. I decided to invoke it. It is permanent, Lenora, in the same way when the binding is permanent. You cannot." "I know," she said quietly. "I know it is permanent. I chose it because I wanted something permanent. I have been thinking about why for a few weeks now, and the answer is that I am in love with you. And I know that is a significant statement given the context, and you do not have to." He cupped her face in both of his hands, gently, with the same careful, deliberate quality he gave to everything he chose to do, and he said against her forehead, "I have been in love with you since the second Thursday." Lenora laughed, and the laugh was bright and completely genuine, and it echoed in the grand court of Nocturne in a way that several vampires would later describe as the most startling sound they had heard in their long lives. "The second Thursday," she said. "That was the one where I told you that your memory of the English Civil War was probably filtered through the aristocratic bias of your social position at the time." "You were correct," he said. "I love you." "You could have told me," she pointed out. "I was building toward it. For 4 more Thursdays. I am 540 years old, Lenora. I move at a considered pace." "Well," she said, "I have now publicly declared my choosing in front of your entire court and invoked a 200-year dormant alliance declaration. So I think we can agree the considered pace has concluded." He looked down at her with the full force of that deep-water gaze, and the smile that was no longer a precursor but the real and complete thing, and he said, "I suppose it has." He kissed her, there in the grand court of Nocturne Keep, in front of every vampire lord and elder, who had not yet made their way out of the chamber, in the amber light of 1,000 candles, with the old language still faintly resonant in the stone around them. Silas Nocturne, the ancient, the unmoved, the last of the first turning bloodline, kissed the human teacher he had watched through a surveillance monitor 12 blocks away, and then built a legal framework to spend Thursday evenings with. It was not a small kiss. It was not tentative or preliminary. It was the kiss of someone who has finally stopped finding reasons to wait. Several vampires who witnessed it would later say, in the particular way that very old creatures describe watershed moments, that the court of Nocturne had not felt the weight of genuine feeling in so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to be in a room where it was present. Vrain, the countess with the frost-coiled hair and the silver eyes, who had been the most vocally skeptical voice in the court from the beginning, watched from the far side of the chamber as Silas held the human teacher's face and kissed her with what could only be described as complete and unself-conscious devotion, and said quietly to the vampire beside her, in the old tongue, that she supposed they had all been wrong about what the ancient wanted. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. The political landscape of the vampire court did not transform overnight, simply because an ancient lord had declared his feelings in front of the assembly. There were formal challenges to the alliance declaration, 3 of them, from court members who argued on procedural grounds that a human side alliance with no precedent in the modern court framework was invalid without a full court vote, which was a position that had enough legal texture to require a response. Lenora and Silas handled it the way they had by that point, established as their method, together and with full exchange of information. Aldrich produced documentation. Lenora read it. She and Silas sat across the library table in the evenings and worked through the legal architecture and the historical precedent and built a case that was presented at a special session of the court 3 weeks after the convocation. Lenora did not present it. Silas presented it because the procedural challenge was a court matter, and it was his to address in that forum. But she had helped build every argument in it, and he acknowledged that in the session, clearly and without hedging, which was a statement in itself about the nature of their partnership, the challenges were dismissed. The alliance declaration stood. Casimir Dread, true to the terms of his agreement, was not heard from. The Eastern District remained quiet. 3 other minor court members, who had been watching Casimir's play and evaluating whether to make similar moves, calculated their odds in light of how the Casimir situation had resolved and arrived at the conclusion that those odds were unfavorable. The court settled into a new equilibrium, one that included, as an acknowledged and protected element, the presence of a human woman who came to the keep on Thursdays and argued with the ancient about epistemology, and had apparently been the thing he had been missing for several centuries without knowing it. Lenora kept her apartment, she kept her job, she kept her Sunday calls with her sister, who was told a version of events that emphasized the extraordinary man Lenora had met and de-emphasized the part where he was 540 years old and ruled a vampire court because some conversations needed to happen in person and gradually. She had Marcus and his Year 10 class present their coastal erosion models to the school's geography department in November, and every single one of them gave a presentation that was, she told Silas that Thursday, significantly better than she had expected, which meant her teaching was working, and she was proud of them in the particular way that teachers are proud, not of the outcome, but of the growth. Silas listened to this with the fullness of his attention, as always. "You light up when you talk about your students," he said. "They are exasperating and remarkable in roughly equal measure," Lenora said. "The best things usually are." He looked at her with the deep water eyes and the quiet warmth that had been building since the second Thursday, and was now entirely open, no longer held at careful distance or managed with deliberate restraint. "Yes," he said, "they are." She threw a pencil at him, which he caught without looking, because he was 540 years old, and his reflexes were approximately geological in their reliability. "That is not fair," she said. "Many things about me are not fair," he said pleasantly. "You chose me anyway." She had, in the spring when the light lasted longer, and the Thursday evenings sometimes spilled over into Friday mornings. Silas showed her the upper levels of the keep that she had not yet seen, the rooms that held the actual accumulated weight of 5 centuries, the records and the artifacts and the objects that had survived things that had ended civilizations. He showed her the way he showed her everything, without performance or display, simply walking beside her and answering her questions when she had them, and letting the silence be comfortable when she did not. She found, in a sealed case, in a room that smelled like old iron and cold stone, a collection of handwritten correspondence that turned out to be letters between Silas and a human diplomat in the 17th century, a man named Thomas Hale, who had apparently been one of the few humans of his era to know about the vampire court, and who had served as an unofficial liaison between the court and the civil government of the time. "You had a friendship," Lenora said, holding the letters carefully. "A professional relationship," Silas said. She looked up at him. "These are not professional letters, Silas. This one is him telling you about his daughter's first steps." He was quiet for a moment. "He died in 1689, Silas said finally. "He was 63 years old. He had grandchildren by then, and he had lived well. And I told myself at the time that this was the correct outcome, that humans lived their span and the court endured, and that the appropriate response was to acknowledge the conclusion and continue. And I sealed the letters in that case, and did not go back to that room for 40 years. Lenora put the letter down gently and turned to him in the cold stone room. "That is grief," she said. "That is exactly what grief looks like. I am aware of what it is. I know you are." She reached for his hand. "I am not going anywhere for a long time. I am human, and I know what that means in this context, and I am not asking you not to grieve eventually. I am asking you to let this be real while it is happening, and not to manage it into something more bearable by holding it at arm's length." She held his gaze. "You let me in past arm's length. Do not change that now that you know how it ends." He held her hand and looked at her in the cold room, and after a moment he said, "In the long history of things people have said to me, that is the most accurate and the most difficult. I know I will try," he said. "That is all I am asking." They stood in the room with the letters and the old iron smell, and the particular quality of late afternoon light coming through the keep's high windows, and they held on to each other in the way that two people hold on when they both understand the full weight of what they have and choose to hold it anyway. The summer came with its particular complications. The long daylight hours that required additional coordination and more careful scheduling, because Silas, for all his centuries and power, was still bound by the fundamental law of his nature, and sunlight was sunlight regardless of how ancient you were. They adapted. Lenora began keeping some of her work at the keep, so that the long summer evenings and nights could be used fully. Silas had the library stocked with materials relevant to Lenora's curriculum for the upcoming school year, which she discovered one Thursday in June, when she arrived to find a table covered in primary source document collections and contemporary pedagogy research, and a note in Silas's handwriting, which was the handwriting of someone who had learned to write before cursive was called cursive, that said she had mentioned in April that she was revising her Year 11 history unit, and he thought these might be useful. She stood at the table reading the note and thought, not for the first time, that the particular way Silas Nocturne paid attention to the things she cared about was possibly the most intimate thing she had ever experienced. She told him so that evening, and he looked at her in the warm library light, with the smile that was now a regular feature of the room rather than a rare occasion, and he said that he had spent 500 years learning what it meant to attend to things with care, and that the only thing he had ever found that made the attending feel Mumban-like more than maintenance was caring about the thing itself. "Do you care about Year 11 history curriculum?" she asked. "I care that it matters to you," he said. "The curriculum itself is derivative and somewhat inaccurate in its coverage of the 15th century, but I am willing to overlook that because the pedagogy is genuinely sound. You read the pedagogy research. I read everything you bring into this room. That has been true since the first Thursday." She crossed the library and sat beside him rather than across from him, which was something they had been doing more frequently, choosing proximity over the clear across-the-table positioning of the early weeks, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he shifted to accommodate her with the naturalness of long practice. "Tell me about the 15th century," she said. "Which part?" "The part that the curriculum gets wrong," he told her. He talked for 2 hours about the texture of the 15th century in the specific detail that only someone who had lived near enough up to its edges to know it could provide. Not the broad strokes of political history, but the particular feeling of it, the social atmosphere, and the specific quality of daily life, and the things that history books recorded, and the things that history books missed because the people who mattered most to the real record of the time were not the ones writing the books. Lenora listened and took notes, and argued with him at 3 specific points where she thought his perspective was shaped by the aristocratic proximity he had admitted to in the English Civil War context, and he conceded 2 of the points and held the third. And by the time the library clock said 2 in the morning, they had collaboratively built a revised outline for the Year 11 unit that was more accurate in 3 areas, and substantially more interesting in 2. "That is good curriculum," Lenora said, looking at the notes. "It is," Silas agreed. "You should use it." "I was planning to." She looked up at him. "You know, when Aldrich first contacted me about the consulting arrangement, I was 90% certain it was an elaborate waste of time. What changed the 10%? He said the client was genuinely interested in historical methodology and would be a substantive participant in the discussion. I have been looking for a substantive participant since my postgraduate seminar, and that was 8 years ago." She smiled. "He undersold it, actually. Aldrich is conservative in his descriptions. You were a person of significant historical knowledge and unusual perspective. He did not mention that you were the most engaged intellectual conversation partner I have ever had, or that you would argue with me about epistemology for 3 hours without checking your phone. I do not have a phone. That is, somehow, part of the charm." He laughed, and she had stopped cataloguing his laughs months ago because they had become simply a regular feature of their evenings. But she still noticed each one with a particular warmth, the way you still notice the specific quality of good light, even when you live somewhere that has it often by the had settled entirely around the new reality. The alliance declaration and the protection binding were part of the formal legal record. Vrain, the countess who had called Lenora a liar in the first session, had become, if not warm exactly, then genuinely respectful, and had twice sought Lenora's perspective on matters of human-side political context that required the kind of understanding that centuries of vampire court life did not naturally develop. Lenora gave her perspective clearly and without condescension, and Vrain received it the same way. And it was not friendship exactly, but it was something functional and mutual, which was its own kind of valuable. Aldrich had evolved from the careful, somewhat formal figure who had appeared at her apartment door with a crisis into something that was approximately the most reliable colleague she had ever had, appearing regularly with documentation or logistical information or occasionally a very dry observation about court proceedings that he delivered with an expression of complete neutrality, and that made Lenora laugh every time. The 3 formal challengers to the Alliance Declaration had all, separately and at different points across the autumn, withdrawn their objections after extended conversations with Silas that Aldrich described as decisive and Silas described as straightforward, and Lenora suspected involved approximately the same quality of quiet certainty that Silas had deployed in the Grand Court on the evening she had first walked into it. On a Thursday evening in October, when the library smelled like cedar and the fire in the particular edition of autumn that came through old stone walls, Silas asked her to stay, not for the night. For longer, he asked it in the ways he's asked everything. Important directly and with full acknowledgement of what he was asking, making clear that the question was a question and not a demand, that her answer was genuinely open and genuinely hers. "I want you to have rooms here," he said. Yours, arranged as you want them, not instead of your apartment, not replacing anything in your life, but here as well, so that the time between Thursdays is not only time you are somewhere else." "You miss me," Lenora said, considerably. She was quiet for a moment, turning the question over the way she turned everything important, looking at it clearly. "If I have rooms here," she said, "I want to be able to come and go freely, not check in or request permission or root through the court protocol every time I leave and return, of course, and the rooms are mine. If I decide I need to cover the walls in student essays or fill the shelves with contemporary fiction that you will find historically inaccurate, that is my choice. The shelves are yours, and you cannot reorganize them." A pause. "That may be the most difficult term so far." Silas agreed, he said, "though the contemporary fiction section will require restraint on my part that should be acknowledged." "Acknowledged," she said, and smiled. "Yes, I will have rooms here." He looked at her with all 5 centuries of himself in his face, the weight and the warmth and the deep water gaze and the smile that was fully, completely present now, and he said, "Good." It was not a dramatic moment. It was not a grand declaration or a ceremonious announcement. It was 2 people who had found each other agreeing on the shape of what they were building, quietly and with full understanding, which was, Lenora thought, better than dramatic in all the ways that actually mattered. The rooms were ready by November, and they were exactly what she had described, hers with her things in them and her marks on them, and a window that looked into the inner courtyard that she immediately identified as the best feature of the arrangement, and that she used every morning when she was at the keep to sit with her coffee and her lesson planning, and the particular quality of courtyard light that was different from street light in ways she had not expected. Silas sometimes appeared beside her at the window, not every morning, but some of them, standing with a particular quality of stillness that meant he was simply present and content to be present rather than in need of anything from the moment. And on those mornings the courtyard light held both of them in it, and the keep was the most alive it had been in a very long time. She told her sister in December. She told her in person on a Sunday afternoon over lunch, and the conversation was long and sometimes difficult, and involved several questions that required her to be completely honest about things that were not simple, and she was, because she was Lenora Wolfe, and she did not do incomplete honesty. Her sister, who was practical and perceptive, and had known Lenora long enough to know the specific quality of her certainty, when it was the real kind, asked 3 key questions. Was she safe? Was she happy? Was it real? Lenora answered yes to all 3 without hesitation, and her sister looked at her across the lunch table for a long moment and then said, with the particular pragmatism of someone who loves you enough to accept what you are rather than what they imagined, that she wanted to meet him at some point, and that he had better be as extraordinary as Lenora was clearly convinced he was. "He is," Lenora said. "He argued with me for 2 hours about 15th century historical methodology and was right about 40% of it. That is your metric for extraordinary. It is my metric for extraordinary." "Yes." Her sister laughed. "When do I meet him?" Lenora said, We are working up to it. They were, in fact, working up to several things. Silas meeting Lenora's sister, which would require a context and an evening and a certain amount of logistical management around sunlight hours and human social norms. The Year 11 revised curriculum unit going live in January, which Lenora was genuinely excited about, and which Silas was invested in with what she had started calling his academic enthusiasm, the particular focused energy he brought to things that interested him. A trip, discussed but not yet planned, to the city where Silas had spent 2 decades in the late 19th century, which Lenora wanted to see because it was the only period of his history she felt she understood least, and she wanted the context of the place to fill in the gaps. There were things they were still figuring out, things they would always be figuring out, because the nature of what they were building was such that it would always require active attention and adaptation rather than arriving at a finished form and remaining there. The difference in their lifespans was the thing they talked about least and thought about most separately, and they had agreed that they would talk about it directly when the time was right, not to resolve it, because some things cannot be resolved, but to face it honestly and let it be part of the full picture rather than the unacknowledged weight beneath everything. That conversation would come. They both knew it would come, but the evening they chose to have it was a Saturday rather than a Thursday, in the library with the fire going, and the cedar smell and 3,000 books around them, and Lenora started it because she was the one who preferred to address things directly rather than carry them. "We should talk about the lifespan difference," she said. Silas looked up from the primary source document he was annotating on her behalf for the January curriculum unit. He closed the document. He gave her his full attention, which was always his full attention. "Yes," he said. "I am 32 years old," Lenora said. "You are 540. I am going to age. I am going to eventually die. You are not. That is the actual reality of this, and I want to talk about it plainly rather than waiting until it is urgent." "I have thought about this," Silas said, which was an understatement of geological proportions, given that he was a vampire who had just spent the better part of a year falling in love with a human. But she let it stand. "What have you thought?" she asked. "There are options," he said. "I want you to know they exist, not because I am presenting them as expectations, but because you deserve to understand the full map. The first is that you live your life as you are, human and complete, and I am beside you for it. And when it ends, I endure what that means for me the way I endured Thomas Hale and what came after, except that this is not Thomas Hale, and I am not certain endurance is the right word anymore." He paused. "The second is that I turn you. I have the capability. The process is neither simple nor painless, and you would become what I am, with the same fundamental nature and its costs. The third is a middle path that exists in old world lore that is rarely discussed, and that I have spent the last several months researching, which is a partial binding through an ancient blood rite that does not transform a human fully, but extends their natural lifespan significantly by several centuries in historical precedent while preserving their fundamental humanity." He looked at her. "I am not asking you to choose any of these. I am laying them out as the honest map." Lenora was quiet for a moment. "The partial binding," she said. "You researched it extensively. Aldrich assisted. It is documented in court records older than this keep. It has been done 11 times in the recorded history of the vampire world. In 9 of those cases it worked as documented. In 2 it did not, and those 2 cases are distinguishable by specific factors that are not present in our situation. You have genuinely researched this. Did you expect otherwise? No, she admitted. I expected exactly this. She looked at him steadily. I do not want to be turned. I want to be Lenora Wolfe. I want to teach and argue about epistemology and call my sister on Sundays and live in a way that is recognizably mine. A pause. But I do not want to leave you after 60 years, and I am not going to pretend that I do, to make this feel simpler or more cleanly human. Then we should consider the partial binding, Silas said, when you are ready, without urgency. It is not reversible, and it deserves the same full consideration as everything else we have chosen. Agreed, she said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the way she had in the upper room with the old letters, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat in the library with the full honest weight of what they were and what they were choosing and all the things that still required courage, and it was not simple, and it was not uncomplicated, and it was the most real thing that either of them had ever held. In January, the revised Year 11 curriculum unit launched, and Marcus, who had been moved up to Lenora's Year 11 class from Year 10 due to an accelerated placement, was the first student to identify the new depth in the 15th century material. This is different from the old version, he said after the first session, in the specific way that certain students have of noticing things that their teachers thought were invisible. Is that a complaint? Lenora asked. No, Marcus said. It is better. The stuff about what daily life was actually like, not just the kings and the battles. How did you find all this? I had a very good research consultant, Lenora said. In the library that Thursday, she told Silas about Marcus's observation, and Silas listened with the focused warmth that was by now simply the atmosphere of the library rather than a remarkable feature of it, and he said that Marcus sounded like someone who was going to make a historian of himself. He is going to make something of himself, Lenora said. I am not sure what yet. That is the best part of this job. You watch the shape of a person beginning to emerge. Silas looked at her, and his expression was the one she had started to think of as his full expression, the one that contained all 540 years of him, without hiding any of them, the weight and the warmth and the ancient self, and the part of that self that had opened like a room that had been sealed for a long time, the windows thrown wide. What? She asked. I am thinking, he said, that I have spent 5 centuries convinced that solitude was the correct answer, that distance was protection, that the court's assumption that I wanted nothing was a useful fiction, because wanting things was dangerous and loss was inevitable, and the arithmetic of immortality required a certain deliberate reduction of attachment. And, she said softly, and I am thinking that a secondary school teacher brought her lesson plans to my library and argued with me about historical epistemology, and changed every calculation I had made about what I wanted, and that the arithmetic I was doing was wrong. Lenora looked at him across the table and felt the fullness of everything they had built, the Thursday evenings and the grand court declarations and the sealed letters, and the revised curriculum unit, and the rooms that were hers in a keep, that was learning to be something other than simply endured. And she said, the arithmetic was wrong because you were solving for minimizing loss rather than maximizing what was possible. Yes, he said, you are allowed to want things, Silas. You have always been allowed to want things. I know that now, he said, and then quieter, because of you. The library held them in its cedar and firelight warmth, and outside the keep the city moved through its winter evening the way cities do, full and indifferent and alive, and inside this room, between a human teacher and a 500-year-old vampire who had spent centuries believing that solitude was the answer, there was something that was neither solitude nor its absence, but a third thing, entirely specific and irreplaceable and chosen. The kind of love that does not simplify things, but makes the complexity of things worth sustaining. Lenora reached across the table and opened the document he had been annotating. "Show me what you found in the primary sources for the second unit," she said. He showed her. They worked until 3 in the morning, and the argument they had about the reliability of medieval chroniclers was the best one yet, and neither of them won it entirely, and both of them were better for having had it, and the library was exactly what it had been becoming for a year, not a room where an ancient vampire endured his centuries in elegant solitude, but the place where everything that mattered to both of them lived, warm and argued over and entirely, irrevocably, beautifully alive. The court of Nocturne Keep, in its long institutional memory, would record this year as the one in which Silas Nocturne, the ancient and the unmoved, chose a human woman and let her choose him back, and changed the shape of everything that followed. Vrain, who wrote the formal record herself, because she had decided she was the only one qualified to do it justice, noted in her entry that the court had assumed for centuries that the ancient wanted solitude, and that in the end it had required a human schoolteacher named Lenora Wolfe to demonstrate, clearly and in front of the assembled court, and at considerable personal risk, that what the ancient had actually wanted all along was exactly what everyone wants: someone worth arguing with, someone willing to hold their ground, and someone who would walk into the most dangerous room available to protect the thing they were choosing. She noted further, in the formal language of the blood law record, that the Human Side Alliance Declaration had been invoked and acknowledged, that the binding was mutual in the way that only genuine choosing can make something mutual, and that the court of Nocturne Keep had entered a new era that was less defined by the solitude of its lord than by the quality of the life he had decided, after 540 years, to actually live. She did not note that she had been moved by it. She was a vampire court elder, and the formal record was not the place for that. She was moved by it, and in the library, long after the record was written, and the court had settled into its new equilibrium, and the January curriculum was running. And Marcus had gotten an excellent mark on his first assessment, and Lenora's sister had met Silas over a carefully arranged Sunday dinner and declared him extraordinary in a tone that suggested she had expected to be skeptical, and had failed at it entirely on a Thursday evening, like all the Thursday evenings that had preceded it. Silas Nocturne sat across from Lenora Wolfe in the cedar-scented warmth of the library that had always been his, and was now in the most important sense theirs, and watched her annotate a lesson plan with the focused, alive attention of someone entirely present in her own life. And he thought that the court had been right about one thing. He had wanted solitude. He had wanted solitude because he had forgotten that the alternative was possible, because the arithmetic of centuries had made him solve for minimizing loss, and he had been very good at it. And the thing he had minimized most efficiently was the specific hope that someone might arrive who would sit across from him, not as a subject or an ally or a supplicant, but simply as a person with things worth saying. She looked up from the lesson plan and caught him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Continue." She threw a pencil at him. He caught it. She smiled. He kept the pencil. Outside, the city moved through its evening. Inside, the library held its light, and Silas Nocturne, who had spent 5 centuries alone by calculation and was now, by choice, something else entirely, was precisely where he wanted to be.